William Rawls, and this is the 90s.
Yep, we're going over the 90s. So first we're going to go over some of the key players in the 90s. I would say that it was split into two different categories. So you have like the early 90s and the late 90s. Very different music happening sonically. In the early 90s, you can say that it was very grunge heavy, very raw, with bands like obviously Nirvana, Alice in Chains, but Sonic Youth, although starting in the 80s, had their big breakout album in the 90s with Goo and Daydream Nation. Pavement, we'll say the most important rock band in history. They were all throughout the 90s. Dinosaur Jr. as well. Obviously, there was Green Day with Dookie, and My Bloody Valentine and Slowdive for the shoegaze that was happening in the 90s. That wasn't really popular in the 90s, but it needs to be noted because nowadays it's very, very prevalent. And the late 90s, you had um, like Tupac and Lauryn Hill coming up in the 90s, Blink 182, Weezer, Oasis, Blur. So there was like the Brit pop rock happening in the late 90s. Sublime and Red Hot Chili Peppers. You can't, not mention those guys. I would consider that the, mainstreamification of grunge and like pop rock that was happening in the late 90s. Um, we're just going to go over a historical timeline. This is going to take a second, but I think it's very important. I do have a lot of things on this PowerPoint, but I'm just going to go over what I think is the most important. So we have 1990 and 1991. MC Hammer releases You Can't Touch This. We all know that song, very, very important. CDs are starting to outsell cassettes. Sonic Youth releases Goo. Guns N' Roses host a very notable concert in Rio. It's the seventh largest concert of all time. It was 700,000 people attended. In 1992, I like to call this year the mainstreamification of grunge. Nirvana releases Nevermind, their breakout album. The most important rock band ever, Pavement, releases their first studio album, Slanted and Enchanted, and Dirt by Alice in Chains releases. In 1993 and 1994, Kurt Cobain commits suicide, sadly. On a brighter note, Hootie and the Blowfish releases Cracked Rear View. I find that CD in quite literally every thrift store I go into. So, there's something to be said there. Rod Stewart performs the largest concert ever with 3.5 million people in attendance. Very important concert. In 1995, 1996, the Beatles' history is televised on ABC and shows off two new Beatles songs that were never aired up until this point. The Grateful Dead break up after the death of Jerry Garcia, and Boyz II Men and Mariah Carey's duet One Sweet Day breaks records, holding number one spot for 16 weeks straight. In 1997 through 1998, Sarah McLachlan forms the Lilith Fair, which is just a festival and tour made up of all female artists presenting. Fleetwood Mac returns and releases The Dance. Elton John remakes Candle in the Wind, and it sells 32 million copies in 37 days, making it the best selling single of all time. Frank Sinatra dies of a heart attack. Aerosmith lands first number one hit, Don't Want to Miss a Thing. The internet, for the first time ever, people under the age of 30 aren't buying more music than people over the age of 30. Companies started watching the internet, wondering if free downloads will impact record sales. In 1999, David Bowie sells album Hours online for $17.98, and Britney Spears Baby releases her album Baby One More Time. We're going to go over some of the charts for a second. So the top 5 artists this is solely based on sales, um, are Mariah Carey, Madonna, Celine Dion, and REM. The top 5 genres are alternative, grunge, pop punk, Brit pop, and pop/teen pop. The charts for singles and albums, top five singles: Bryan Adams, Everything I Do It For You. Sinead O'Connor, Nothing Compares to You. Celine Dion, My Heart Will Go On. Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You. And Madonna's Vogue. Best-selling albums are Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill. Nirvana, Nevermind. Whitney Houston, The Bodyguard. Metallica, Self-Title. And Santana, Supernatural. These are just some of the references that I used to get this information. We're going to do a little analysis on what I would say is probably the most important album of the 90s. Nevermind, or yeah, Nevermind by Nirvana, which is not their first album, being Bleach was their first album, but Nevermind put them on the map, made them as well known as they are. Um, we'll say, a lot of people like to say that this was really the death of the sound of the 80s, the very electronic electronica of like Tears for Fears or something like that, the very new wavy sound of the 80s. This was quite the opposite of that. Very Sonic Youth inspired, very raw, very heavy, very emotional. Promoted a raw authenticness that was lacking in the music industry up until that point. The lyrics dealt with themes of isolation, depression, and disillusionment. It led to more introspective lyrics from that point on across multiple different genres. Kurt was able to become the face of punk, surprisingly, even though this was not a punk band, and that's why it led to the genre that is now known as grunge. His untimely death will forever be remembered by the music industry.
And here we are going to talk about some of the sociological effects that the 90s had to culture and music. The message was embedded in 90s music that had a powerful sociological effect, shaping public consciousness around identity, resistance, and emotional authenticity. Rock had its anti establishment lyrics, also validated emotional vulnerability, especially among young men. Hip hop, starting up and shining a spotlight on racial inequality, police brutality, inner city struggles, amplified marginalized voices, and urban realities, encouraged the youth to be active, to be active in activism and cultural pride within the black community. Gender empowerment, like previous said, Britney Spears' album came out where women were more sexualized and they had a positive body image. In the 90s, music and culture movements played a pivotal role in reshaping gender empowerment, especially through the lens of the third wave of feminism, sort of like the Spice Girls came in through the 90s, Britney Spears and was this TLC. Rejected male dominant music norms and creating an all female punk band, promoted self publishing zines, body autonomy, and political activism, sparked controversies around sexual violence, reproductive rights, and intersectional feminism. Feminism. It also media and MTV and media and the music business started to globalize all across the world. In the 90s, music movement had a transformative sociological impact on culture, communicated, consumed, and connected across borders. MTV and VH1 expanded internationally. Everybody remembers TRL and those musical countdowns that we watched in the music videos that came out in the 90s. Created a shared global youth culture centered around music, fashion, and lifestyle. Standardized pop culture references across countries fostered a sense of global belonging, and some of those are like "What's up?", "Talk to the Hand," "As If," "What's up, Home Slice," and "Cut It Out." Fashion was big. We transitioned from highlighter ski jackets and disco in the 80s and big hair rock bands to more of a settled down flannel shirts, ripped jeans, oversized t-shirts and sweaters with Doc Martens. We had baggy and saggy jeans, oversized shirts that came down between the knees and the even as far as to the knees. We had track suits, gold chains, Timberlands, and branded sneakers. That was within the urban culture and the hip hop scene. We also had black Jinko jeans, spiked belts, button down shirts, and backward hats. Or if they didn't have a hat backwards, their hair was all gelled up in mohawks and spikes for rock and roll and punk. And some of the technological advances that happened during the 90s, we saw a shift from analog to digital, marked by the rise of CDs, and they were outselling cassettes. The development of digital audio workstations like Pro Tools, which enabled access to home recordings. The decade also introduced MP3 format, which was file shared through Napster, fundamentally altering how music, was shared. This is why we have the digital libraries we have now. Is Napster pretty much started that with file sharing, and the labels and studios needed to gain money from that, so they shut Napster down and they started, selling the music digitally online soon after. Production and recording, like I said, digital workstations, Pro Tools allowed for home studios to be more prevalent than ever in the 90s and the early 2000s. We have the rise of home studio. We have MIDI technology, so you can make beats from instruments without using instruments, but just using electronic devices, MIDI instruments. We also have auto tune that was starting big in the 90s, and you could goes on further into the 2000s with T-Pain and some of the other hip hop artists as well. Distribution and consumption changed in the 90s, from cassettes to CDs, MP3s to file sharing, and even enhanced CDs. Some CDs you would have would be not a DVD, but it would be extras when you put it into computers or DVD players. You would have some types of music videos or photo albums within those CDs, embedded in those CDs. So people would get more than just music when they purchased these enhanced CDs. And of course, the first portable digital players came out in the 90s, which forecast the digital revolution in music that's happening today.
So that's, I would say, the 90s, I would ask if anyone had any questions, but this is a video on YouTube, so
Was 1999 Woodstock, or was that 2000s when like Korn and all them happened and all that stuff happened in New York?
I think that was in the 2000s.
Okay.
So, yeah. All right, well, that's the 90s, so yeah,
Hope you enjoyed.
yeah.